All right, well, today we're going to talk about week 7 of spring semester 2025. Thank you again for watching these videos. I hope you're really learning some fun things as I share my experiences going through school to get a degree, master's degree in history, basically, and religion. So this boy, we did a ton of reading this week. We had so much to cover. It was amazing. So I'm going to try to summarize it all up here as succinctly as I can for you. So to begin, I'm going to start with my interfaith class. In my interfaith class, there were two things we had to read. One was a bridging differences guidebook. This is kind of a manual of how to do work with people. So if you're doing um, uh, like mediation type work, would probably be the best way to say it. So it just is a bunch of skills like how to do mediation. How can you help two groups resolve some differences or challenges that they have with them? So in this book, we learned what are called bridge building skills. These are skills that you can use to help you in help you people that are dealing with situations. This is how you can start to build bridges and start to help them to understand more, like get to a better place where you can actually help these people to resolve whatever challenges or concerns that they're experiencing. That, whether that's like a faith crisis that they might be having, or a challenge to their own selves that they're dealing with. This could be two different groups that are having an issue with each other. So these are skills that you can use to help each person to start to get to a better place where they can start to do more. You can start working on healing and getting through the challenges that they're facing. So let's talk about these skills, the 5 skills that we went over for bridge building. I want to kind of help you to be aware of these so maybe you can use them in your own life. So one is assume good intentions. What we're talking about here is learning when you get into a situation, people do what they feel is the best decision they can at the time. So with limited knowledge, with limited resources, they make the best decision that they can at the time. So it's important for us to realize that and just realize, okay, I know the outcome didn't turn out the way we wanted it to, but the intention behind the outcome was most likely a good thing. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes people just want to be jerks and hurt people, but most of the time people don't. And so we can assume good intentions. What were the positive intentions of the other person? What were your positive intentions for how you responded to it? So that's a good framework to start with, is just assume that there were good intentions, and let's explore those and understand those a little bit better to help it go, oh yeah, okay, I can see now, they made a bad choice, but their intention was good. So we can kind of give them a few points for that. Another one is practice mindfulness. Sometimes when you have that stuck state that you're in, lots of fear, lots of anger, resentment, things that are happening, sometimes it's good to just go, okay, let's just take a second here and let's just be mindful for a little bit. Let's kind of focus on our breathing for a minute or two. You don't have to do like a major meditation or something, but practicing a little mindfulness in the moment can just help people go, oh, okay, let's relax. Let's get out of the negative emotion of this situation, come to a bit more of a positive state, neutral state, so that you can then think better and work on the situation that you have. Another one of these ideas, these skills, was expand your activities and expand your views. So sometimes we get so focused on the issue, so focused on what happened, that sometimes we need to kind of outframe the experience a little bit more. Let's look at this from a more third person perspective, kind of step back away from it, take in the greater view of what was going on around this, because sometimes that can help us in seeing, oh, I was so focused on this one little thing I didn't realize there was more happening here. And this sometimes can happen where we miss details, we miss things because we're so hyper focused in the moment, we don't realize that there was other things happening that could help inform the experience and help us understand what was really going on. The fourth skill is seek and promote counter stereotypical information. So when you're doing this, this is basically taking a different perspective of what happened. Let's look at things that from a different perspective. How could this have been a good thing? How could this have been different? So kind of getting more of a three-dimensional perspective of the situation. Oftentimes when you get in situations where either you are having a hard time or you are having a hard time with another person, we get so narrow focused that we forget there's more to the story. There's more going on. So taking time to gain perspective of this can help us to go, oh yeah, well that's true. Maybe it's not quite as intense or bad as I thought it was, and I forgot that there was these other things going on that were actually really good and helpful, and so it helps us to gain more resources and get us to a position where we can start to pull things together to help make change. So those are really good skills. Now the fifth one is focus on individuality and not group identity. This is very common, especially in internal conflict. People sometimes will have where they will, which comes up a lot in like a faith crisis type situation, where they get stuck in between the group mentality, the group think, group beliefs of this group that they're part of, and then themselves. And sometimes we get lost in the group. We forget ourselves and we get so stuck in what the group is thinking that we lose, in a way, our own identity or our own self in this. So sometimes helping them to see themselves as distinct within the group or separate from the group sometimes will help them to go, oh yeah, okay, that's right. I need to still understand myself. I need to still understand what I'm doing. Here's what the group is thinking, and I don't have to buy into the group all the time. Or I can help understand that I'm still okay even if I'm not a part of that group anymore. That sometimes causes issues, especially when somebody's again in a faith crisis, leaving a church or things like that. Oftentimes, churches, they get into all aspects of our life. So sociality is through church. Our connections in the community, our status within the community is all connected through church. So when you leave church, does all that go away? Are you just adrift at sea type idea, in your community? Or are there still meaningful connections and things that can happen? And so that's a good thing to think about, is sometimes we have to help see themselves different from the group to gain some perspective going, oh, I'm okay still, even though I'm not a part of this group anymore, or I don't agree with this group mentality of everybody else. So it's just helping them gain perspective so that they can start to go, oh, okay, I can see better what's going on, and now I can start to improve the situation or heal from the situation. So we talked a lot about those kinds of skills this week. We also read a summary. Jana Reese, who is a religious journalist, did an interview with Thomas Fielding McConkie. Now, if you're LDS, that name sounds familiar because Fielding and McConkie are very common. This is Thomas, I believe, is either a son or a grandson of Bruce R. McConkie. He's a guy that he was born and raised LDS, lived through the church, but he didn't fully buy into the church. He kind of, he acted Mormon for many years, but then eventually he decided, I don't know if this is for me, and then he left. He had a crisis of faith. He ended up leaving the church, found his way to Buddhism, actually. Became a Buddhist, started to do more things that way, meditations and so forth. And he said what was fascinating is while he was a Buddhist doing meditation, he found Jesus, which sounds so funny because Buddhism doesn't believe in a God, let alone Christianity's God. But in his meditation, he, in a way, had a spiritual experience, almost as if like he was meeting Christ. And so it shocked him. And so he started to look at Christianity again, wasn't sure where to go, and eventually found his way back into the LDS church. So now he's a Mormon Buddhist. Basically, he kind of does both, and brought his Mormonism back full circle, and then brought Buddhism into his Mormon faith also, which is kind of cool, interesting combination. I think there's a lot of connections between those two. So he wrote a book about dealing with faith crises. And so read. I've read the book as well. I've kind of goofed in the homework assignment. I thought we had to read the book, not just this article that Jana Reese did with him. So I read the whole book last weekend, and it's a pretty good book. In there, he talks about there's different like stages that people deal with faith challenges, and so it's a good book to read. What he did is he took human development research and he overlaid it into religious context to understand how does these stages of human development as far as understanding of what's going on around us and put that over with religion. So how does this inform us of how do we deal with the faith crisis, basically a challenge to our faith? It was a really good book to read, really interesting, different concepts. Some people they're so strict in following the rules that if you have a faith crisis, they don't want to talk to you. They kind of see you as bad and evil, and even in themselves, if they feel like a faith crisis is brewing inside themselves, they suppress it and ignore it. And then there's other people who embrace it and start to work through it. And so it's a really interesting book to get into. I don't remember off the top of my head the name of the book, but if you look up Thomas Fielding McConkie on Amazon, you'll find it. It's not hard to find. In fact, he's got a whole website about it. If you Google him, you'll find his website where he talks about the 5 stages and goes through those things as well. So fun book to read. One of the things I liked about his book was the idea of normalizing a faith crisis, and this is something I've talked about and have really studied myself. In fact, there's a series on my on this YouTube channel. If you go look up in the playlists on the 7 things every ward council should know, one of them is on faith crisis, and I think this is something we need to normalize more within religion, especially LDS faith. That a faith crisis. So when you learn something that seems contradictory to the way you've believed about the church and about religion, that's okay. That should be relatively regular. If you're really studying your religion, you're going to have a faith crisis every so often anyways. And that's okay because you're learning. You're improving your understanding of what your religion really believes. So, and these principles still apply to any religion out there, not just the LDS faith. But it's important to examine that, okay, and look at it and realize, okay, just because I learned something that seems contradictory about my religion, it contradicts everything else I know about my religion. There's a couple things I want you to understand. Just because you learn something that is very different than what you already know about your religion doesn't mean that one thing you learned is bad, and it doesn't mean what you used to know in the past is all bad. Okay? People have this either or mentality that sometimes gets in here. And I think this is a common opportunity for Satan to mess with people is you're going along in church, you're doing your thing, and then you find out about something that was so radically different that you're like, whoa, what was that? I don't know. Some people complain about early polygamy in the LDS church with Joseph Smith and others, or Mountain Meadows Massacre that happened just outside of Cedar City, or other things like that that'll come up, blacks in the priesthood or whatever, and they take this one thing and they feel like, oh, if everything I used to believe is true, then this has got to be false. Or what if this is true, then everything else I used to believe is false. And so instead of taking the time to nuance it out and really examine what's going on, they kind of want to throw either or away. It's like an absolute, either this is right or this is right. If this is right, then everything I knew was wrong, and I have to throw all my religion away and start over. And then it confuses them, and then they're like, I don't want to be a part of this church anymore. That they think there's some evil, weird, crazy stuff happening, and then they want to leave. And it doesn't have to be an either or. Honestly, it just realize, oh, I have learned something I didn't know. It contradicts or seems to come in conflict with things I've learned in the past. So let's take these 2 items, let's put them on an equal platform. Let's examine both of them equally and realize there's some truth and some faults in both of these. Let's nuance this out so that we can find the truth and we can eliminate the faults. And that does mean that we oftentimes have to be willing to change our own belief. that we've currently held because it might not be 100% true. When we learn truth, we have to understand that we rarely learn all the truth about it at the same time. We usually learn a little bit of truth, but there's still more to learn. And so what we know isn't the full truth, it's partially true. And that's the key to always understanding that. What we know is good, but there's probably more to learn. And that what we learn, the more to learn might change some of the things we thought we believed in. We might look at it and go, oh, I didn't realize that I believed in that idea, that I need to change that so that it fits better with with this new things I've learned. So in that video that I did in that other playlist for War Councils, I gave tons of examples. I mean, the thing to realize is in the scriptures, to be a prophet of God, to be a representative of Jesus Christ, you're going to experience a lot of faith crises. Like everybody went through numerous faith crises, and you can see this if you read the Bible and even the Book of Mormon. Everybody who's been a prophet has had major challenges to their faith as they've gone along. That's how they learn more truth. That's how they keep expanding their understanding of the gospel, is realizing, wait, this is different than what I used to believe. I need to change what I believe. I need to adjust this. Let's focus on finding the truth and go that direction and eliminate the stuff that's false. All of them have had to do it. I mean, it's everywhere. So this is not an uncommon thing. So understand, from my perspective, a faith crisis is when your current belief system in religion is being challenged. That's okay. That's normal, that's natural, and that should happen from time to time. If you do not have a faith crisis from time to time, you're probably not really studying the scriptures deep enough to actually understand them. That happens a lot, okay? And that's a bad thing. If going to church, if doing things just, it feels easy, it's normal, it feels great, then what you're doing is you're focusing on your interpretation. And you have a lot of people in your ward that have a similar interpretation of the scriptures as you, and that builds a unity and a cohesion among you. But then you just stay in that little spot and you don't actually learn that there's more to learn. So having those challenges, having a new member come in that has a different way to think about the gospel, doesn't mean they're wrong because they're different than you. It means maybe I need to change, maybe I need to learn and improve. So that's a faith crisis. That's a simple one. But it's important that we keep learning. If we're not reevaluating our beliefs every so often, like thinking through, is this really true? Do I need to tweak and modify this? Is there more I could learn about this? We need to be doing that from time to time anyways. So it's a good thing. Now, having what I would call a faith exodus, where you've gotten to the point where you don't know how to get out of the situation you're in, you're so stuck that you really need help and no one's there to help you, that's when people start leaving the church. So let's be more supportive of people who have a question they're battling about their faith. Let's work with them. Let's understand them. Let's talk with them. Let's give them resources, okay? Let's not push them out or shun them or see them as bad if they're questioning things. It's okay to question. We should question. The whole reason, if you look at the scriptures, the biggest reason we have what we have today is because people were questioning things. So we have to keep looking at this. And we don't have to question it to question it. We're not trying to question things to disrupt and challenge stuff, but we want to keep learning the truth. And that means we have to keep asking questions, keep digging, keep looking at how can I improve what I believe. And that means you're going to have those faith challenges and faith crises from time to time. It's just part of your journey. Conversion is not an event. It is a journey. You need to keep working on being more converted to the gospel. That Moroni 10:3-5 thing that missionaries do, that is not just for people who are joining the church. That is for even current members who are wanting to keep learning. Keep learning, keep improving your understanding. It's so important to do. So that was a fun class. I had a great experience with that one. In my 3000 level class, getting into more about how to do historical research. This week we spent a lot of time learning about what's called microhistory. I think I talked a little bit about it in the previous videos, but a microhistory is something that is a type of history. So if you think of like studying history, there's a lot of times we're thinking about studying larger trends of history, like let's study the history of World War II. Well, that was multiple years, multiple continents, millions and millions of people involved, a lot of things happening. So a micro history would be like, let's take one person during World War II and let's understand what happened to them during that moment. So that could be one soldier in World War II. That could be a civilian in World War II. Things like that, and it's just focus on what they did. So to do this, we had to go into there's a bunch of databases online where people's journals from the past have been digitized, and you can read their journals. It was really fun to read through some. I picked one at random. We just had to pick one and study 3 weeks of their journal entries, and then start to do a little bit of surmising of it and do our own little micro history about them. So I picked this woman who grew up in Topeka, Kansas. Her journal entries were the year 1942. So if you remember, America entered World War II in December of 1941. That was when Pearl Harbor happened. December 7th, I want to say, was when Pearl Harbor happened, 1941. By the end of December, so during the holiday time, America was fully in the war. They were enlisting men left and right. They were getting ready to go and start to help Europe fight Germany and help the Pacific Island areas fight Japan, and even fight against Italy as well. So in North Africa and that in the Mediterranean area. So this is a journal of a woman. She's probably 19, 20 some odd years old. And what was it like to be a young woman at the beginning of World War II? Really interesting stuff. She didn't write a lot about herself. Like, she didn't write down, here's my thoughts, here's my feelings, here's what happened to me today. She doesn't even, her journal is more about other people around her than her. It was really interesting how she did not focus on herself. She focused on everything else around her, which says something about how she believes about herself. But for my little micro history on it, I looked at what was it like to be a young woman in Topeka, Kansas at the beginning of World War II. So if you realize that society at the age of 19, 20 years old, for a woman, society is telling her, hey, it's time for you to find a husband, find a man, get married, and settle down and start having babies and have a family, and respect and honor your husband, and go along those lines, the Leave It to Beaver type story. But here's the problem for her. Her first name was Claire, if I remember right. So she has a love interest. There is a gentleman named Tom that she almost spends more time writing about Tom's life than her own life in her journal. This is almost a journal of Tom, basically. It was really interesting. Every time he shows up, she gives us a big explanation of what he was doing and how things were working and stuff. And so I think Tom, she doesn't come out and say her feelings about Tom, but it's kind of obvious that she really likes Tom. Like, he's the number one figure in her journal, even more than her about herself. She doesn't write about herself, but she wrote a lot about Tom. So she's interested in Tom. But here's the problem, okay? Tom is around a similar age as her, most likely, which means he is subject to selective service in the draft. So he might go to war at some point. In the 3 weeks of journal I read, he had not been called up to war. But now he's also trying to find a job. So as a man, he's got to find stability so that he can have a family and take care of take care of himself and his family. So he's out getting a job with Boeing, and that didn't work out. So he's got to go somewhere else. He actually goes all the way to Pearl Harbor from Topeka, Kansas. He goes to Pearl Harbor in January of 1942. So the destruction of Pearl Harbor is still there. They're still trying to clean up from all that and mobilize the war effort. He goes out there to take the exam to join the military. And so, like, to get into, not to just enlist, but to be more of an officer. So he's out there going through that experience, and he finds a job in Santa Clara, California, I think, doing something else. I think he eventually starts to settle down there. So he's back and forth a lot. He's traveling all over looking for a job in the defense industry to support the war efforts and to provide an income. What does Claire do? She's the office administrator at her brother's orthodontist office. She helps do the bookkeeping for her brother and accounting and stuff. And so she just has this normal day. You know, she goes to work, comes home, hangs out. She lives with her sister, so they just kind of hang out and do stuff together. Sometimes people come to visit and chat. They're, you know, mending clothes and reading books and listening to the radio. And then once a week around Wednesday, her and her sister go down to it's called the Cozy. It's basically like a movie theater. They go down and watch a movie, catch a show, and then they come home, you know, and it's just this normal routine. She's buying a chest of drawers so that she can have a place to store her things at this house that she's living with her sister. You know, so you can see she's in a way preparing herself to have a house and a family, and waiting on Tom to finally pop the question and finally have that stability so they can have a family and do things. And so it's just interesting. You know, it's only 3 weeks out of her journal, but it was fun to see what was it like to be a young woman at the beginning of the war. So traditional family ideas were being challenged because all the men are going to war. So the availability of men to date really drops off. So that limits her opportunities to find who's a good man. So maybe that's going to delay her ability to get married. The guy that she wants, Tom, is traveling all over the country looking for work. That might mean she moves away from her family to go be with Tom, to go where his job is. And what does that mean with the war effort? How long is that going to last? Is the war going to last long, or is it not going to last long? Does his job change when the war ends? How does all this work? So it was traditional norms were being severely challenged with this war. War was growing across the whole nation. There are concerns of what happens if people attack us here, what else is going on. So a lot of upheaval in life at that time. So a microhistory, again, is focusing down on like one person and telling an instance of theirs. We mentioned in the class Carlo Ginzburg's book, The Cheese and the Worms, which I read last semester. So if you want to read more about that, it's a story about a guy who he got wrapped up with the Italian Inquisition twice in his life. So he's just a guy, just a laborer guy doing stuff at a mill, you know, working, doing his thing, learns how to read, which was uncommon, but he did get the chance to learn how to read, started reading books, didn't realize that there's a difference between Catholic reading and anti-Catholic reading, starts reading whatever he can find, ends up starting to believe in some anti-Catholic ideas, starts talking about them. Somebody turns him into the Inquisition. He gets arrested, thrown in prison, goes through the Inquisition, and they decide, okay, we're just going to beat you and then make you wear this big yellow t-shirt for the rest of your life that says you are a heretic. And so people won't want to deal with you. So he loses employment. He has lots of problems because of it. He has to go travel to other places, and he's limited on his travel. So it kind of ruins his life. You know, his wife and son eventually leave him in his older age, and then he gets caught with the Inquisition again and goes back to jail. And you know, it's a crazy experience. But it's all about this guy, his life. Carlo Ginzburg wrote it. It's a really good book. He kind of pioneered microhistory with that book. So it's just fun to study. Microhistory is a fun thing to get into because it gets really nuanced. And rather than broad perspectives of history, it really nuances down, which is kind of fun. So that was a fun thing to get into. We read a book, if you want to find it, called Montalut. Montalut is a little town nestled up in the Pyrenees in France that they were an anti-Catholic group. There was a religious movement in the area called Albigensianism or Catharism, and this little group, this little community, like 200 people, so most of them were farmers or sheep herders, They had this little town that they had a little priest over the town, but everybody in the town eventually became a Cathar instead of a Catholic. So they kind of left the Catholic Church and became a heretic according to the Catholicism. And so there was a priest, and he's Catholic, of course. He's one of the Catholic priests in the area. And priests at this time have tons of power because of the Inquisition and things. And so if there's anybody he hates, he can just call him up to the Inquisition, and the Inquisition will come arrest him and take him away. And so he actually, if somebody treats him bad, he just turns him over to the Inquisition and gets his revenge on him. And so people don't want to piss off the priest. So the priest ends up in a situation with a lot of power, where not only is he getting tithes, he gets a percentage of all the tithing he collects from people, but he takes bribes to get out of inquisitions. And so he turns into he gets too much power, basically. And what does that do? It corrupts him. So he takes bribes from people. He ends up with lots of mistresses, which is against the Catholic Church, but he gets mistresses. And so it's this interweaving of like everybody knows all the sins of everybody else. And so there's this like unwritten rule that, look, nobody turns each other in, because if one of us turns one of us in, they're just going to blabber and the rest of us are all going to go to jail too. So we're all stuck, you know. We want to be better, but we're all sinners, and so we don't want to turn each other. We want to turn each other in, but then we don't, because that's just going to come back on ourselves. So it's this weird situation that turns into. So Montalou, you can go find it. It's in PDF form, and you can read it. It was really a wild story of deceit and problems and challenges that happened. Oh, it was nuts. But that was kind of another example of microhistory. So let's get into my 4990 class. This class, we were talking this week about the flood of Noah. There's lots of stories in Mesopotamia about floods. These flood narratives are actually quite common. Now you have to realize Mesopotamia is desert. Okay, they don't get a lot of rain, but when they do, man, can it rain. And that floods. They have sand, but they also have a lot of rock. And so just like in southern Utah, if you go down there, or northern Arizona area, it's desert, but there's a lot of rock, and so there's nothing to absorb the moisture, so the moisture runs off. So flooding is just a part of nature when you live in a desert. It's just going to happen. It seems weird, but you either have no water or too much water, basically, in a lot of situations in deserts. And because there's a lot of rock, the water doesn't absorb. It has to run off. And so it has to go somewhere, and it collects with more water and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's why I have these big washes and canyons that come through, that they look like a dry river was there, because that's what it is. So flood narratives are quite common in Mesopotamia. And if you think of the Nile and Egypt, okay, one of the seasons in ancient world around the Nile is the flood, the inundation period. So when you think of seasons, like we think of spring, fall, summer, winter in northern Utah, or northern America, basically this northern hemisphere, in Egypt, they have the dry season, they have harvest season, and they have inundation season. So inundation is when all the moisture from rains and snows and things in Central Africa start to flow north downhill through the Nile River, and then it just floods. So the Nile goes from just this little river basically to this really wide flood that's maybe only a foot or two deep. So it's not like it's super deep, but it's really, really wide. It covers a huge area. The big alluvial plain fan, the Nile flood area, floods the whole place, and dumps like another half an inch to an inch of fertile soil on top of everything, and then it retreats back down to just the Nile. But that fertile soil now is soaked, has lots of new nutrients from upstream, and lots of stuff can grow. And then there's that growing period, and then at the end of the growing period, it gets so hot, everything dies, and it's just all sand. So that's the Nile area. So there's lots of stories. So when we look at the Noah flood story, some scholars think the Noah flood story is a localized story. It's not like global, like the book of Genesis talks about, that it was a global flood. it is and I don't know. I think you can look at it from either perspective. Could it be a localized event? Yeah, there's an argument to be made that maybe it wasn't literally the whole world was turned into a water world. If you remember that movie Waterworld, kind of like that. Um, Although I think that's still 100% plausible and most likely what did happen according to what we know from Genesis. But a lot of scholars want to focus it and say this only happened in Mesopotamia. It didn't flood the whole world. And we can't say from the perspective of Noah and his family, it would have just, it would have, as far as they're concerned, there's water in every direction. Everything's flooded. Now, if you've been on a cruise, it doesn't take very long to get away from shoreline enough, just a couple miles away from shore, you can't see any land. So he could have had land nearby, but didn't realize it, So but anyways, there's the flood story. The oldest known version of the flood story we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, I've talked about him a little bit in the past. He is this guy, this kind of a half god, half king, human king person, goes on this amazing journey to meet these like phenomenal people. He meets this guy, Nuptashin or something like that. I don't remember how to pronounce it, but basically kind of a Noah type guy that claims to have survived the Great Flood and became an immortal because of the flood. So Gilgamesh interviews him. Really, I think the Epic of Gilgamesh was basically this guy wanted to write a story that made himself sound super amazing. And so he took a bunch of other stories from other histories and wrote his own version of everything that put him as a central figure through it. So he wrote a narrative, built his own fake news to tell his story, make himself sound amazing, and immortalize himself in literature. I think that's a very possibility with Gilgamesh when we if we ever find out the real truth about him. But anyways, it's the oldest version of the flood story that we have, the inundation story, mainly because we don't have a lot of original writings that were used to create the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible with. We have the Hebrew Bible, but the oldest we get is still around like 150, 200 BC. We don't have records that allow us to go much further than that back. So when we think of Epic of Gilgamesh, it was written probably closer to like 700 BC. So it was a much older tradition. So sometimes scholars look at it and go, well, we don't have anything else, so it must have originated with them. And then the Hebrews took Gilgamesh's story and put it into their narrative to tell an amazing story for themselves and put it into their own Hebrew Bible. So there's different perspectives of the story. One thing we talked about a lot was Ham. What's up with Ham? This was really interesting because in the story of Noah, after the flood, he offers sacrifices and things, and they're back on dry land and they're trying to grow and harvest and do things. He eventually plants grapes, starts a little bit of a vineyard, creates some wine basically, and which was common. That was just a normal thing back then. He ends up getting drunk. He's in his tent, and it says that he's drunk in his tent basically, and Ham happens to poke his head into the tent, come into the tent, and sees his father's nakedness. And he makes a joke about it, laughs about it, and then tells his brothers about it. And then in the story, his brothers come in and they turn themselves backwards so they can't see their father. They put a garment on each of their shoulders. They walk backwards to lay the garment on their dad to cover his nakedness. And then they leave. And then after the next day, when Noah is sober, he hears the stories of what his son Ham did. And then he curses his son's son, Canaan, the third or fourth son of Ham. So when you look at this story, you think, well, this is weird. I mean, okay, Noah being drunk and being naked is one thing. If we look at the English translation, it sounds like Noah was naked in his tent, was drunk. His son saw him naked, made fun of him, paraded around with his garments. Oh, look at me, I'm so funny, and things. And then the other brothers were like, dude, this is disrespectful, don't do that. They respected their dad, so Ham gets cursed. And not just Ham, but his son Canaan gets cursed. And so you have to look at it and go, where does Canaan fit in all this? Like, why does it, oh, your dad did something wrong, but I'm going to punish you for your dad's wrongdoing? It seems like there's more to this story than what we're getting in the Genesis account. So we looked at the some research papers on ancient Hebrew, some other scholars that looked at the old Hebrew to try to understand this. And when you hear the term saw his dad's nakedness, we realize that that term gets used sometimes in other parts of the Bible. That it can, in other parts of the Bible and in other stories of that from that time period, using the term saw someone's nakedness means intercourse, basically. So oftentimes it's used where a man sees his wife's nakedness, meaning they consummated their marriage, they had intercourse. So in if we take that idea of how they use that term, that phrase gets used in the rest of Old Testament, and we think of, could that be possible in this Ham story, that leads you to a conclusion that maybe Ham, he had a sexual experience with his father, which sounds really weird and abhorrent, but it's so some people will translate it that way. Now, if you look at this story, though, also when you talk to, there's other stories of uncovering a husband's nakedness. When you uncover a husband's nakedness, usually what you're talking about is the wife. Because wives are in the Old Testament, wives were seen as property. Wives were seen as a possession of the husband. So to uncover the husband's nakedness isn't to have intercourse with the husband, but to have intercourse with his wife. And so there's a possibility. This was really interesting to look into this. There's a possibility that what Ham did was Noah and his wife had been drinking and were about to have intercourse, and Ham interrupted it and ended up having intercourse with his mother. And then he bragged about it because we have to realize, and in my Bible videos that I've been working through, we talk about this in several instances when sex is brought up in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. More of the Old Testament is talked about than the New. But when they bring it up, we have to understand that at that time of history, sex was seen as a way to exert power and authority over others. So an invading army would come in. If you lost the battle, the main army that won would oftentimes come in and have sex with a lot of the women of the village that lost. That was a way of exerting authority over them. The idea of having sex with your servants was a way of exerting yourself over them. So sex back then was man on top, whoever on the bottom. It could be a woman on the bottom, it could be a man on the bottom. The man on top had the power, they were giving, the person on the bottom was receiving. And so when we think of the idea of what's illegal in sex in the Old Testament, it was illegal for a man to be on the bottom because that's the powerless status. That was reserved for women. Men had the power status. So, but it's not that it didn't happen. Men would exert power over other men by having a sexual experience with them, and the man on top would be the leader or the one in authority over the other man. Boys that were servants, this was common where a man who had male servants would have a sexual experience with those young men, to exert that authority over them. So they thought different about sex than we do today. We have to always remember that. So this idea of Ham having sex with his mom basically is him gaining power and authority over his father's stuff and trying to usurp his father's power and authority in a way. And so that's where the curse came from. And I think that's very possible when you really look at it and you get into how it's phrased in the Old Hebrew. It's amazing how you're like, oh, the English version doesn't allow that part of the story to be told, but the Hebrew leaves that door wide open that that is a very good possibility. Now, this brings in, where did Canaan come into this? Okay. If Ham slept with his mom, maybe his mom got pregnant and had a son that would have been Ham's son, Canaan. And so Canaan got the curse because he came from this cursed experience. And so that's why it transferred to him, which is really interesting how that works out. Now, a lot of people believe that Ham's wife was a descendant of Cain. That's where they got the blackness from. We didn't get into that part of the story, unfortunately. Um, but a lot of ideas of racism come through this idea that of blackness and things. The curse wasn't the skin color. The curse was lack of connection with God. Was more of what that is. So we have to be careful imposing today's concepts of racism onto these old stories because it was different. They don't think of the way we think of racism is not the way they thought of racism, basically. So we want to be careful with that. But interesting, as we get into this textual analysis, what else is there? When you get into the Hebrew, there's so much more variability, so much more to learn and understand that we don't even realize. Like we talked about at the beginning of the semester in the Hebrew, it gives us more emotion. The English translation of the Bible takes most of the emotion out. We don't get a lot of emotion from the people, the characters in the book. But in the Hebrew, it shows more emotion. It shows more words that help us understand, were they excited? Were they sad? What was going on in their emotional state? So studying the Bible isn't just reading the English translation. It really is, there's more to it. The English translation is not even an original translation. Okay. The Old Testament was Hebrew, Old Hebrew, not even modern Hebrew, Old Hebrew. The New Testament was Aramaic and Greek. So there was, what was I listening? It was Dan McClellan was doing one of his videos about talking about some guy, some Christian person that was spouting off some fake Christian beliefs on TikTok. And this Christian guy that was spouting off these things made an interesting comment that you know, that the English, English was good enough for Jesus to give us the Bible in, and so it's okay for us. And I just laughed. I thought, oh, this is so stupid because English didn't exist as a language back then in Jesus's day. Jesus spoke Aramaic, not English. The whole Bible was written in Aramaic and Greek, not English. So it got translated into mainly Greek, but then that got translated into Latin and Ethiopic and other languages, and then eventually it made it into Old English, and then got updated into Lesser Old English. But it's been through translation after translation after translation after translation after translation to get to where we have the King James Version today. And even now today, we still have newer English versions of the Bible. So English doesn't do the Bible justice. There's so much more to learn as you get back into the older understandings. Looking at the Greek in the New Testament helps you see a lot more about what really was going on. Looking at Hebrew for or Greek for New Testament, Hebrew for Old Testament will teach you so much more, get you so much more vividness of the stories. It's amazing. So some fun things we've learned. Hopefully you've learned some great stuff from this. Feel free to comment what are things that really stood out for you from what I learned this week, things you picked up on, and we'll see you next week.